Hi everyone, I'm Manuela Lazic, and this is You Gotta Act, a podcast about actors and acting. For this very special episode, we have a very special guest, Nico Marzano. So Nico works at the YGA. He's the head of cinema, and he does many other things. The actor that Nico chose to talk about is Gian Maria Volonté. But before we get into this, Nico, can you please talk a bit about yourself and all the work you do?
Ciao all. Thanks, Manuela. Thanks for inviting me on your podcast.
You're welcome.
Yes, I've been working at the YGA now for the last 7 years as a film programmer, as a film curator. My academic background is quite bizarre because I actually studied law when I was in Napoli, because my dream was to fight mafia and becoming a judge. But then, the concept of truth was something that I started to struggle with, and also the love for cinema invaded my life. So I studied film studies in Ireland, in Dublin, which is where I lived for many years, where I still somehow live in between London and Dublin, because my son lives here in Dublin. It's where I'm talking today as well. During this lockdown, I've been based here in Green, Dublin, and nothing. And then, at the YGA, we try to support film that is truly independent in nature, in terms of production. And the program of the YGA is a program that somehow can be perceived as 3 phases. No, the program that takes place at the YGA weekly, with our 2 screens, with our 450 films per year. Then the festival that takes place every year in April, called Frames of Representation, which is a festival that embraces cinematic languages that sit at the intersection between fiction and non-fiction. And then there is also a further support that we try to provide for the independent film scene, which is through the distribution arm that we currently have, which tries to bring films beyond London and tries to bring in the UK films that otherwise would not been circulated, experimental in nature, radical and political. My field of research, curatorially, has always been rooted in political cinema. That's the reason why today I'm very, very happy to talk about Gian Maria Volonté, because Volonté was definitely an actor that belonged to that current, not only current in terms of film wave that developed in Italy at the end of the 60s, which is political cinema, but also because his idea of cinema was very political, but never propagandistic. So this is and then I write about film. I like also to talk, as we will do today, about film.
Yeah. I mean, so that makes, like you said, it makes perfect sense. You chose Volonté. And also, I was reading through the notes for the upcoming Frames of Representation, which unfortunately has been suspended until whenever it can happen. But the theme this year is spectatorship. And I read that in your notes you wrote that the festival will aim to challenge the relationship between presentation and action.
Yes.
So it seems like the theme of the festival will be exactly what the Volonté films you told me to watch are about, which is making the spectator not just a passive person, but someone who, by the film, is motivated to do something.
Correct. And yes, there is definitely, even if you, and we will talk about some of the filmography of Gian Maria Volonté, there is always an overlapping between fiction and non-fiction in his works, and also the directors that he decided to work with. In the case of Spectatorship, yes, for me, the idea which started actually with a French thinker, writer, Jacques Rancière, no? His very important text, The Emancipated Spectator. And he was talking about theater as well, not only cinema, and the idea that there should not be any expectation or vertical division between who is producing, providing, giving in terms of actor or art institution, like in the case of the YGA for films representation, and the spectator. There should be a fluidity of discourse between the two parts without any level of expectation. And this is like, definitely something that for me it's very interesting, because also connects back to the films that I try to present within the context of films representation, that are films that fluidly move between a structure of fictionalized storytelling through then more non-fictional works. And that fluidity in producing and then making a film and then presenting a film in a physical space with the presence of spectators, for me was very important. And then the irony of everything is that now, even more so, spectator are basically under siege by this COVID-19 pandemic. So I hope that we will have the chance to do it at some point in October, November, in some form of shape, because of course we need to take into account of the limitations, but it would be, for me, a very strong political statement to come back with a program like Frames around the spectatorship,
Yeah, 100%. It seems like not only with COVID, but also with what's happening with George Floyd, we are bombarded with images and videos, and we are being asked to act. We're being asked to go out on the streets. We're being asked to protest to the government, all through images. But also there can be, as we can see with Trump, for instance, some manipulation. Trump going and, gassing people so he can take a picture of him with a Bible. That's fully also using images to try and incite people to do something, but in the dangerous way. So yeah, I hope you can do it soon.
That's absolutely. I don't know. Did you have a chance to see today the YGA Daily that I contributed for the YGA?
I don't think I read the one today. No.
Not because it's interesting what you are underlying right now, because my entry was suggesting a book of 100 pages that I read the other day, which is called Thinking in an Emergency. That's the title of the book. And postulates exactly what you're saying, that in a time of emergency, we are pushed to act, rather to think. But this is a clear political intention from the establishment to take away any possibility of understanding what they're trying to advance, just in order to advance their own agenda. While thinking is such a fundamental idea, because thinking also is an act of resistance within ourselves, because while you think, you are conquering yourself, because every morning I wake up and I may have some negative impulses, rage, ideas and thinking allows me to take a distance within myself. If you just say no, we have to do it and act, it's a sort of political agenda that can really be dangerous.
Definitely.
So, it's an interesting text, and it's very short. It's more like a long form essay rather than a book. It's 99 pages. Thinking in an Emergency.
Perfect. I'll read that. And it seems to go back to Volonté. I would say he was thinking a lot. I mean, to say, because he to look at the movies you recommended I watch, they are all these political movies, but interestingly, Volonté actually became famous with spaghetti westerns.
Correct.
So that was interesting to me, because I thought, he just made spaghetti westerns, got famous, and then he did what he wanted. But in reality, in my research, I found that he got into theater and acting because he had to make money and he wanted to escape his home, where his dad was a fascist who went to jail. And because he was in jail, he put the whole family at risk, and financially as well. So it's very interesting how he had this sort of start in political work, political theater. Then he got fame with spaghetti westerns, and then he went back to his real calling.
Absolutely, you know, and we don't have to forget that he basically started his career in the 60s, as you correctly said, then, you know, rose to fame through the spaghetti western genre, with Sergio Leone in particular, gave him, like, you know, a sort of positioning within, like, you know, the actor, like, you know, landscape. But he was also then, like, you know, we are at the end of the 60s when that big turmoil took place across Europe and in Italy as well. Because in Italy, at the end of the 60s, especially in Rome, across the whole country, but especially in Rome, there is a big tension between students, proletariat, police. Again, we go back to Floyd, and, like, you know, the police. Pasolini very famously takes a very provocative stance, saying, "I am with the police." But why he says that? During the end of the 60s, 1968, there are these famous clashes in Valle Giulia, which is a place in Rome where police are beating students, because he's taking a stance against the middle class bourgeoisie that is taking the streets just in the name of belonging, but not of a real militancy. And he's saying, in some cases, these cops are instead the real working class, you know, working for very little money. So it was a very important, like, you know, as usual, Pasolini, Pierpaolo Pasolini is an illuminated poet, you know, that paid with his whole life for the courage of his very anti-establishment ideas. Volonté was very similar to Pasolini. That's why I'm also drawing this comparison, because Volonté, in my view, in terms of artist, because, you know, he was an actor, but he was also an author in himself. Like, you know, all the directors, you know, he worked with possibly the greatest, like, you know, Elio Petri, Montaldo, Francesco Rosi. They all say that his influence in shaping the films is very important. But why? This also connects why I decided to suggest you that we would look at Gian Maria Volonté, because big part of his filmography, especially the political cinema of his filmography, is rooted into films that are somehow docudrama, hybrids between fiction and non-fiction. So on the political, historical side of these films, he always had a very strong take. And I have a lot of, like, you know, funny episodes that I learned throughout the years about him, about his political militancy while he was shooting films, like Giordano Bruno, for example.
Giordano Bruno is one I couldn't find, unfortunately. I couldn't stream it. But it sounds, like I was watching Todo Modo as well, rewatching, and I found I had read that when it came out, everyone on the political spectrum was saying they don't like it, because it was that period in Italy when the Democratica Christian or something, the Christian Democrats, and the more socialist left-wing people were trying to make peace together, in the public eye at least. And he said, Elio Petri said that everybody was saying in the public that they didn't like the film, but in private, the left-wing guys were telling him, "Oh, we really like the film." So, and then when I watched the film, I was like, of course they didn't like this. It's so hardcore against the establishment.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, all Elio Petri films, like, you know, I mean, maybe to also help our audience to be familiar with a film that it's more readily available than Todo Modo. I don't know if you had a chance to watch the least clips, or you watched the film of Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion.
I watched it. Yeah, I watched the whole thing. I loved it.
It's, like, you know, it's an incredible film because, again, 1971, a film that won also an Oscar as Best Foreign Language Film. It's, like, you know, it's really a big, heavy critique to Italian society, not only to police and to their sense of impunity, but to Italian society. I don't know what really struck you when you saw that film.
Well, when I watched it, it made me think a lot of the film American Psycho, because it's kind of the same structure of a guy with a lot of power because he's in this sort of is in a system that gives him a lot of power, and he plays the game, he plays along. And he in American Psycho it's more unconscious, but he starts kind of trying to get caught, trying to break all the rules, and he realizes that he can't, because if the system tries to stop him, the system would have to destroy itself, and the system doesn't want to do that. So in American Psycho, when Patrick Bateman goes crazy, he's like, I killed all these people, and everybody's like, what are you talking about? Go back to work. And he's very sad because he wanted to be found out. And it's the same that happens here, but it's a more American Psycho is about capitalism and white capitalism in America and the finance sector, whereas Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion is about a more political, more obviously political area. And but it does it in a much, I think, in a more not, I wouldn't say subtle, because it's not really subtle, but it does it in a more interesting way, because I think Volonté's performance is very, very in American Psycho. Patrick Bateman is played by Christian Bale, and his performance is very high camp, whereas Volonté is more like I believe that he could have been a real person, which is much more scary.
No, absolutely. Like, you know, and that is way of, like, you know, he's an actor that always, like, you know, works, like, you know, with the method, no, and he's into the character, like, you know, completely. If you read a lot of the stories behind, like, you know, his other films, he's to the point that, you know, it's impossible to deal with him. You know, another thing about Volonté is that he was a very complex character. You know, for as much as he was always frontline to fight the struggle of the working class and, like, you know, taking on a lot of these right issues, at the same time he was a very, very multi-layered, complex character that was actually sometimes very difficult to deal with. And in Investigation, for me, yes, there is, you know, a critique of the police system wanting to defend itself, and him trying to play with that to demonstrate his own power while demonstrating the power and the desire of acting as a caste from within the police. But it's also a big critique on the media behavior of those during those times in Italy, across the world, and then sadly also a sort of testimony on how little things have changed. Is this beautiful scene where he gives the speech, no, to this big room of people, and you remember what he does? He basically is mixing up, you know, the lines on the wall that are supporting Mao Zedong with instead the number of homosexual people that were labeled by the police, you know, to see how you can easily manipulate the narrative, putting everything together. And then when it's a big soup, you know, it's difficult to then, like, you know, make a very clear cut judgment. And then, like, you know, him, it's like, you know, you are really, like, you know, for those who have not watched film, I really hope they can watch film, because you are scared by him, like, you know, especially when he's acting in those moments that he's relating to his colleagues, no, because he's this police inspector, freshly promoted chief of the political crimes, you know, and he comes, you know, we are not spoiling anything, he comes freshly from murdering while attempting an erotic game with his mistress. So and then the film takes, you know, as departs from there, basically.
Yeah, I agree. Like, he's genuinely terrifying in that film, and that's the first of the films you told me to watch that I watched. And his performance in that is so intense. I was watching it, I was like, why is he screaming all the time? But he's really screaming and he's really engaged. And I think that's another thing about Volonté that I realized watching his work, is that he was really good at playing leaders, like the police guy, or in the other films as well, because he had a genuine charisma. And there's so many of his films where he gives actual speeches. We watched the Mattei Affair.
Yes.
Was it this one?
Yeah.
Yes, the Mattei Affair, the one where he plays the guy who created the Eni oil company.
Enrico Mattei, yes.
Yes. And there's a scene near the end, I think, where he's giving a speech to an entire small town, the town of Galliano. And Volonté is genuinely giving the speech to an entire town. And it's just, I think if you put another actor there, that could have terrified them. But he seemed very much comfortable with this kind of performance, but also comfortable with playing people who were the bad guys. I mean, Mattei is a bit ambiguous, but that's also something I found very interesting about him, is that he was comfortable and he was really willing to play people from both sides of the equation. Like even though he was very engaged, he wasn't just playing the good guys. You know, he wasn't Tom Hanks. He was trying to play everyone.
No. I mean, you know, and you could see also, like, you know, with Enrico Mattei, no? Il Caso Mattei, the Italian title for the Mattei Affair, amazing film by Francesco Rosi. Again, like, you know, there is a, you know, the film is also a perfect example. I'm very happy that you're bringing this up, of merging fiction with non-fiction. And we're talking about 1970, I think 1972 must be Il Caso Mattei. Early 70s anyway, where the director Francesco Rosi had a friend called Mauro De Mauro, which was a journalist that was killed by mafia during the shooting of that film. So he decides to not only to represent a story like Il Caso Mattei, Enrico Mattei, the president of Eni, that while being ambiguous, because they were still, like, you know, exploiting workers to some degree and stuff, but definitely they tried to keep the big company, resources company, nationalized, state-owned, and fighting against, like, you know, the danger of selling it to, you know, North American companies. It became another private enterprise. So I'm sure that was what really fascinated Volonté, to be able to play that role. And then at the same time, a film that goes in different direction, because Mauro De Mauro, this journalist that I was mentioning before, was killed during the shooting, was a friend of the director, and Francesco Rosi decided to use real footage of him looking for Mauro De Mauro. And then, like, you know, that period is also the period of another important piece of Italian history, which is the killing of Aldo Moro. Aldo Moro was this important politician from the same party that you were mentioning before, Democrazia Cristiana, Christian Democratics, and he was kidnapped by Red Brigades, and at that case completely overshadowed then, like, you know, the killing of Mauro De Mauro, that was a journalist that was not really well seen by mafia, and therefore killed. But Volonté, not coincidentally, played also Aldo Moro in
Il Caso Moro.
In Il Caso Moro. I have a very funny episode about Il Caso Moro. I went to give a conference, a workshop, actually in Nicaragua, Managua, in February, just before all this COVID-19 thing happened. And after this workshop that I give on cinematic language, I was taken to a restaurant for dinner by a Nicaraguan filmmaker. She's a documentarian, actually, as well. And she said, I would like to thank you. Let's go to eat to this Italian restaurant, no? And I thought within myself, I said, I can't all the way. You know, it's 10,000 miles to go to Managua. But okay, let's go. I said, no, it's very good. And then I want to introduce you to the owner of the restaurant, who is an Italian guy that's been living in Nicaragua for now nearly 35 years. And he's an interesting character. So, and he helped the Nicaragua revolution to fortify the Sandinista revolution had to basically become what it became. So for us, it's a dear person, even on a national level. I said, oh, definitely. So I go and I talk to this very incredible man all night, the owner of the restaurant. He was coming and going from the table about us, so Italy, end of 60s, his political commitment and stuff. And then he said something towards the end that made me curious about, because I said, why did you leave Italy 35 years ago and you never came back? And he said, you know, my idea of Italy at that time was really impossible to reconcile with what was happening. And that and I went online, I Googled, and he was bloody one of the guys that was part of the commando of Red Brigade that kidnapped Moro. And he's basically a wanted man internationally. But, you know, it's not that I'm disclosing or putting in danger him, because, you know, it's clear, you know, he got a political asylum from Nicaragua, and Italy knows where he's working.
I see.
There was even a comedian, sarcastic TV show in Italy called Le Iene that went to look for him in Managua, Nicaragua, to the restaurant. Incredible story. Amazing man, and very knowledgeable. But, you know, we were talking about Il Caso Moro and Volonté that night while eating this beauty, and he's a great cook.
Right. So there is good Italian food in Nicaragua.
No, actually, very great Italian food in Nicaragua.
Okay, great. Because the other thing interesting about Moro is that not only did Volonté play Aldo Moro in the Moro Affair, or in Caso Moro, but he also was very much inspired by him for Todo Modo, apparently. And yes. I was fascinated by what I found in my research. I found that the director, Elio Petri, said that the first few days of shooting were for nothing, because Volonté was playing his character way too much like Aldo Moro. And it would have been way too obvious that he was playing Aldo Moro. So they were like, okay, we need to start again, because if you play him like this, the film will never come out. And therefore they had to change it again. So it really seems like he had an incredible ability to play real people. And that's like what you were saying about mixing documentary and fiction, because so many of his characters that he played were genuinely real people. And I think, to me, the most amazing example of that is when he played Vanzetti in Sacco and Vanzetti, because Sacco and Vanzetti is the story behind that very famous John Baez song, the one we know, here's to you, Nicola and Bart. And I didn't know this. I know this song since I was born, probably. Anyway. And the story is of these two Italian workers that in the 1920s were arrested. I'm just explaining for people who listen. Yeah?
Important to say anarchists as well. Workers
anarchists.
And anarchists. Like,
exactly. You know. And they were arrested supposedly because they had done some kind of robbery. But obviously the real reason was because they were anarchists. And the American government at the time was very much against communists, because it was not so much that they didn't like communists, it's that they didn't want workers to have rights. So they were cracking down on communists. Anyway, end of the story is very sad. These guys are basically scapegoats for the entire anarchist movements. And one thing I found incredible doing my research is I obviously looked at real pictures of Sacco and Vanzetti, and the expression on their faces are exactly the ones that the actors, especially Volonté, have in the film. And these are people that were evolving in the 1920s, so we don't really have video documents. We don't have much else except those very famous pictures. And somehow, from that, and probably from his Vanzetti's speeches and all that, Volonté built a person, and he lives him, and it's just insane. It's just incredible.
At that film, like, you know, Volonté plays Bartolomeo Vanzetti, one of the two anarchists, the other one, Nicola Sacco. There is a moment at the end of the trial when they are convicted, where the judge asks them if they want to say anything before the conviction will then, turn the executive, and then they need to go to face that sentence. And there are those 2 minutes where Bartolomeo Vanzetti, Gian Maria Volonté, say something about why he is standing there, and he knows that he's being now killed because of being anarchist. Said that if he would need to do it again, he would do it again, because all his struggle was to erase the exploitation of the man on the man, of the human beings on other human beings, from working. And for me, that is one of the most powerful speeches that anyone could give. And you are completely agree, even the elements of his face when he was talking, and if you see pictures of Bartolomeo Vanzetti, they are the same. But it's famous, his studies of the character were so intense that even during shooting, that's why I was saying that during Giordano Bruno, the film, Montaldo, the director of this film, that is about this Italian philosopher that was set on fire for his radical ideas. Montaldo was saying that he would be locked in the room without leaving the room, and the room was also so smelly because he would not take a shot, because he was just there focusing on his performance. In a way, the intensity of his performance remembers me, I don't know if you perhaps agree or disagree, with Joaquin Phoenix,
100%.
Same level of intensity, same level of empathy, same level of they both have clearly an incredible charisma, an incredible even they appear as strong characters, strong men, but there is also an incredible level of soft and tenderness that has to do with their human pursuit. It's they are constantly in pursuing of an humanity. Now, even going beyond the character that they play, even when I watch some Joaquin Phoenix interview, I have that impression, of someone damned,
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because we on this podcast we have talked about Joaquin Phoenix in the previous episode, so this is perfect. But I totally agree about this this humanity that comes through, and I noticed that a lot in Investigation, because throughout the whole film, the character of the inspector, Il Dottore, is being this very hard, tough, brutal man. But then there's that section where he starts losing it, and he starts being really scared, because he's like, they're never gonna, he's like, it's quite ambiguous. We don't know if he's scared that they're gonna catch him or that they won't, but he starts really breaking down. And it's genuinely heartbreaking how terrified he is. And I think Volonté translates that sensitivity buried beneath the violence so well. And it's such a nice payoff, because the whole film you see this man being just a brutal wall, and at the end it just breaks, and it's such a nice payoff. And it feels like, I'm guessing Volonté probably had a similar work method of being tough and tough and tough until he could let go at the end. It really feels that way.
This is a very, very interesting remark, and resonating so true with I think who he was, because now, while you were mentioning this impression of him that you have of him, reminded me of another film that he played in 1991, which is called Open Doors, by Gianni Amelio. Beautiful film, one of the last few films that he made, because then he dies by heart attack on the set of Theo Angelopoulos' Ulysses Case in 1994. So 3 years before, he makes this film where he plays this progressive Italian judge in Sicily. And the film, it's all about process, about law, administration of truth. Incredible film. And there is a young actor playing there, at the time young, very good actor still now, fantastic actor both in theater and cinema, called Ennio Fantastichini. And if you go and Google up on YouTube, there is an interview that Ennio gives about his experience of working with Gian Maria Volonté in 1991 on this film, that he was saying, you know, for me, working with Gian Maria Volonté at that moment of my career, but even now, he said, but, you know, definitely then that I was just starting as an actor, it was a dream. You know, for me, Volonté, at the end of his career, already 60, was God, like, you know, in terms of acting and political commitment. And so I went there, first day of shooting, and I went to him, and he clearly rejected me. You know, he did not want to have any sort of interaction of set, and actually was very harsh and unpleasant to that point, that he really stayed with me during the day of the shooting. Then last day of the shooting, you know, Gian Maria came to me and said, now we can be friends. You know, because they were on the different side of, you know, they were against each other in the film as characters. So he could not allow himself to leave, not even for a second, that zone. And then he said that from then they had, like, you know, a very wonderful relationship. And Ennio Fantastichini turned out to be a great actor, like, you know, very, very, like, you know, engaged actor. And but, you know, that was him, like, you know, was, like, you know, very and to go back 1 second on the idea of how he always plays with real character, real stories, and sometimes how this, it goes beyond Gian Maria Volonté. I think it's the power of cinema as an art form, no, that can help us to analyze not only ourselves, the times and society that we live in, but sometimes can anticipate what happens. There's this film called Slap the Monster on Page 1, 1972, by a director that I think would be familiar to some of our listeners, is Marco Bellocchio.
Oh, yeah.
Marco Bellocchio's latest film, The Traitor. It's a depiction of Buscetta, but instead, the Slap the Monster on Page 1 was a film about a newspaper that was called, on a fiction level, Il Giornale, the journal. It was about this editor, chief editor of Il Giornale, manipulating a story which was a real killing and rape of a young girl, and basically finding a scapegoat in a left-wing student, a politicized student, and making him convicted for was a fiction film, but was telling a story that was way too familiar, and sadly still very familiar. 2 years later, actually, an Italian writer, journalist, right-wing, founded Il Giornale, which then became a newspaper that is still in circulation, is still right-wing, still manipulates truth as they wish, racist. And Indro Montanelli, actually, and this connects also with our real current times, and with, for example, the destruction, the right destruction of the monument in Bristol. He was basically made into a statue once that he was dead, because he also had some important role within the Italian landscape of journalism. But now, in these days, they are talking about the removal of that statue, because he's been, you know, very openly fascist, racist, and it's incredible, no? How everything resonates with everything when it's done with a certain art craft.
Definitely. Literally all these films felt they could be about exactly this moment today. I mean, Indagine was all about the police and how it's got way too many means and too much to do, and it's rotten at the core. And there's literally a moment when, during that speech you were mentioning, he says, we need more money for the police. And I was like, oh God, this is exactly it. And
terrible.
And yeah, and same with Sacco and Vanzetti. It feels very relevant to the Black Lives Matter movement, and it seems like the radical ideas, sadly, perhaps they need a lot of time to be implemented, and that's why these movies that were made in the 70s are especially relevant, 50 years later. But it seems like also those films, for instance, Sacco and Vanzetti, the targets have changed now. It's not about communist, well, although it's not about Italian immigrants, but now it's about African Americans, and it's about Asian people, especially in America. But the issue is still the same, the issue of trying to blame everything on radical people and turning their fight into something else and completely dismissing them. And
it's the issue of repression. Is repression to maintain the status quo. Ultimately, it's the idea of power that is sick. And in order to maintain that power, you fight the collectivity that is trying to promote certain, issues. And, because, in the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, it was an attack on anarchy, because anarchy was seen as a political system that would have brought a level of representation that then would have undermined the power. So that's why, no, it's, and, it must be said, for Gian Maria also, that his political commitment towards the working class was always very, very high, and towards anarchism as well. There is another very interesting little clip, a short film that he made himself, directed and acted, about the killing of a young anarchist in Italy called Pinelli. And he basically, in this short film, is reconstructing the moment of the killing of this anarchist, because the police say that he, while under arrest, jumped out of the window. Instead, was, killed by police. And he, it's a beautiful little short film. I think it's, I don't know if I remember correctly, 13, 14 minutes, but it's amazing, black and white. Or, we should also definitely mention and remember, I don't know if you had the chance to read about or to even watch it, Working Class Goes to Heaven, by the same director of Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion, which is Elio Petri. Just a little digression. Elio Petri is a fantastic, underrated filmmaker that deserves a lot of space. Definitely. I did a little program at the YGA, one of the first years that I was there, about Elio Petri. He only made 10 films between the 70s and the 80s. But each film is different one to another, adopting different genre, different acting style. But at core, all is very political. He was actually loved in France. The only country that gave him some sort of resonance or representation was France. But in
that
Italy,
doesn't surprise me. I mean, especially in the late 60s and 70s, France was all about rebellion and all that, and that would make sense. But I think I had heard of him when I was still in France. So there you go.
Oh, wow.
I think I had heard the name.
So sorry, this Working Class Goes to Heaven, just to give a little hint to our listeners or viewers, if they want to look this film up, which I wholeheartedly recommend to watch. He's playing a character called Lulu Massa that has a very interesting journey, because he starts as a worker in this factory, as the most productive worker, actually so productive that was undermining the struggles of other colleagues and workers and union, because it was setting the bar so high that everybody in the 70s, usually you get paid for as much as you produce. And he was producing like hell. To also the price to pay was his lack of engagement with his family, with his wife, incredible actor Mariangela Melato. She's amazing. And then during the film, there is something, an accident that happens to his finger that changes certain dynamics, and he actually takes on the working class struggles. And then he gets fired, and then the film, has a different ending that I will not spoil, but it's fantastic.
Sounds wonderful.
Film.
Yeah. That's like what I was saying earlier about how he could play people on both sides or people kind of in between. Like I think Mattei was a bit more ambiguous. But it goes back to what you were saying about thinking and not just acting, which is ironic because he's an actor, but you know what I mean? He seemed like he would, through his work, he wanted to genuinely take the time to put himself in the shoes of the opposition and genuinely try and work through how they got there, why, what they want, and therefore find out how to defeat them, hopefully. And I can't think of many actors that do that today, but I also can't think of many films that are about this as much. I mean, I know at the ICA you do program some films that are in that vein. But do you think that cinema today is doing anything nearly as powerful as all these directors were doing with Volonté?
I mean, at the moment, I think for sure there is like, a big wave of directors, especially from Latin America, for example, that are working on that intersection that we were mentioning before between fiction and non-fiction, that are doing a very important political work. I'm now thinking in Brazil, for example, there are different representatives of this political cinema that in a way it's taking up the legacy of Glauber Rocha, and
yes.
it's Argentina as well. But even if we go back to Europe, I cannot fail to mention Salome Lamas in Portugal. She's doing an amazing job when it comes to merging artistic practice with the political investigation. To stay in Russia, or to stay in Europe, Russia is another place that a famous representation. We showed Alexander Baturov The Son, which was very interesting depiction of the military environment currently in Russia. This year, I hope that we are going to show a film from Ukraine, and it's a film within a film. So Irina Shink, the director, is capturing the life of this family south of Ukraine, where they are shooting themselves a film to find some sort of reconciliation with the idea of war, with the idea of aggression from the perspective of the Ukrainian family. And that is The Earth is Blue as an Orange. That's the title of the film.
Oh, but that's a famous French poem. That comes from a famous... La terre est bleue comme une orange. I think it might be Paul Éluard or something. It's one of those surrealist guys. Yeah. But that sounds great. That sounds really cool. But
there are a lot of right now. Must also be said that an actor like Gian Maria Volonté, I think that it's an unicum in Italy at the least. If you think of the 20th century in Italy and also these 20 years in the new century, I cannot find anyone, not even close to Gian Maria Volonté. So everybody talks about Marcello Mastroianni, many other great actors. Of course, we had Mariangela Melato, Sofia Loren, Gina Lollobrigida, all great actors, but what Volonté brought to the table of acting, political investigation, and it's unique.
Yeah. Even I have to admit, Marcello for me is the top, but I have to admit his movies are not nearly as political. I mean, he is in Todo Modo, but otherwise, that's true. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we've talked for a long time. But that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I learned so much. I feel like I learned a lot, and I hope people will learn some things too.
Likewise. I really enjoyed.
And thanks so much for choosing Volonté, because I knew him, but only vaguely, and I feel so glad that I found out. So thank you so much for that as well.
My pleasure. That was my idea, because I know. I've been now living outside Italy for the last almost 20 years now, and I know that still is not that well known as an actor or as an auteur, because I consider him without diminishing the role of acting, but he's way beyond. He's not just someone that is going there to do his job, the job that has been commissioned to. There are many more layers and reasons why. He did the majority of the films that he did, and So, I was happy to somehow spotlight him and to offer the chance to our listeners and viewers to get familiar with the with the work.
Yeah. And also one thing I hope to do with this podcast is make clear that, like you say, an actor, sometimes they're just doing the job and they go home and everything is fine. But sometimes an actor is an author, an actor is part of the story. For instance, I couldn't imagine, as much as I like Mastroianni, I couldn't imagine him playing the main character in Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion, because that just doesn't make sense. And that film without Volonté would just not be the same. So I'm glad you agree with that, because that's what I hope to do. So yeah.
Thank you.
We're gonna end here. So thank you so much, Nico.
No, my pleasure, absolutely. And hopefully, whenever we come back, you and Alessandro are already in London, but whenever I will come back to London, we can meet up, and hopefully at the YGA.
I hope so.
Hoping it's still open and running, and we can keep working.
We'll hang out at the Frames opening night, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to or watching this episode of You Gotta Act. Support us and find special episodes and more on Patreon at patreon.com/YouGottaAct. Follow us on social media and let us know what you think. See you next time.